I grew up with 4 Nazi grandparents. I had no idea there were Nazis before I knew what a Nazi was when I was 13. And then I was seriously shocked by what people did. And I've started despising Germany because of this heritage. And I didn't really want to be associated with any of that. So nowadays, for me, being German, this means I live in a country which has a fairly strong democracy still, which at the moment what I see is a country that struggles, but a country that has become a lot more diverse and open. But like anywhere else, we have our problems, and they are very similar to the problems in the United States.
Welcome to the future of our former democracy. I'm Colin Cole, Director of Policy, Outreach, and Communications at More Equitable Democracy. We're a racial justice organization that's focused on election reform based in Seattle, Washington.
And I'm Heather Villanueva, the Deputy Director at More Equitable Democracy.
In the last season, George and I explored the history of Northern Ireland and how they ended up changing their electoral system in response to real systemic conflict and how it made things better.
I learned a ton about Northern Ireland and history in that last podcast. Now, as we explore Germany, I get to be a guide. Last season, we looked at what the U.S. could learn from the electoral system in Northern Ireland and how implementing a system of proportional representation was a huge part of bringing the north of Ireland out of 30 years of violent sectarian conflict.
This season, we're going to compare how far-right factions have operated within the U.S. and Germany's electoral systems, and how electoral systems impact the political power of those far-right elements.
Let's go.
We start with breaking news from here in Germany, where Chancellor Olaf Scholz has lost a vote of confidence in Parliament. Scholz won the support of only 207 lawmakers, far short of the majority needed to win.
We initially looked at Germany just to observe their snap elections last February. But the more we learned, it started feeling really essential that we impact not just how their electoral system works, but also how they've navigated a really turbulent century. And grappling with that history has informed exactly how they handle the rise of the far right today, which they're seeing in numbers, frankly, not seen since just before World War II.
More Equitable Democracy went to Germany for complementary reasons to why we decided to go to Ireland.
We see aspects of ourselves in this other country and think that there's something to learn. Most people think of European democracies as like really old. France has been around for a really long time. England has been around for a really long time. Germany is actually a younger country than the United States because they didn't come into existence until the 19th century.
And Germany had in its early democratic history a really huge divide between the right and the left. Society was really polarized in a way that's actually kind of rare in democracies. Usually there's more of a middle and the extremes are real outliers. But what we're seeing in the United States today and what we saw in Germany back in the 1920s was two very far apart extremes. And that really resonates. Today, there is a growing far-right movement in Germany that's anti-democratic, it's anti-immigrant, it's anti-multiracial democracy, and they're facing very similar challenges to us in the United States. And we wanted to explore how resilient is German democracy in the face of a rising far-right, as compared to how resilient the United States is, or maybe appears not to be. We will be looking back at the conditions post-World War I that provided fertile ground for Hitler's rise and a close look at how Hitler, the man, used the people, economic conditions, and relatively new electoral system to his benefit. Hitler's rise was not inevitable. There were many off-ramps, and there are things that we can learn from watching democracy fail that can help us understand our system. It feels hard to say that we're going to learn the way from them because they're still on a very dangerous path.
Right. Like all democracies, German democracy is not perfect, and it certainly has its fair share of problems. And so the question, isn't to what extent should we just cut and paste exactly what Germany did and try to replicate it here in the United States, but it's a question of, are there things that happened to Germany earlier in its history that we can learn from and want to avoid? And are there things from contemporary Germany that they're doing pretty well and we might want to learn from that might make things better?
Tonight, a major political shift in Germany that could send shockwaves across Europe. CBS's Holly Williams is in Berlin tonight. Good evening, Jerika. The Alternative for Germany, or AfD, is on track to win about 20% of the vote here. They are far-right, anti-immigration, and want closer ties with Russia. And they have the support of Elon Musk.
Martin Lang, our Berlin tour guide extraordinaire, reflected with sadness on watching this rise of far-right extremism as it entered the mainstream through AfD, walking with us through downtown Berlin on a freezing day in February.
They are difficult because they have moved from a serious right-wing party as they started 10 years ago or more, and they moved to an extremist party, right? They're right-wing extremists. And this is not my personal opinion. This is what an institution called Verfassungsschutz is an institution that is directed by our Supreme Court, so to say, or Constitutional Court. They have categorized them as clearly anti-constitutional and therefore watch. They're becoming more and more open about their plans to change our constitution, to end democracy, to end pluralism, to reverse some of the things that have recently been passed, like the self-determination law just last year in November, that people can choose freely what gender, what sex they want to have in their passport or ID. They would reverse that immediately, stuff like that, right? So this is exactly the stuff. And then, of course, they use clear Nazi methods. Like just a few weeks ago, people with migration background in, I think it was Karlsruhe in the southwest of the country, found letters, fake plane tickets, go back home, one-way ticket back home or whatever, printed on it. And that's exactly what a former Nazi party in the 90s did and what the Nazis did with fake train tickets for Jewish people in the 1930s, right? So this is, they're not even hiding it anymore, right? And there's so many, especially for somebody who's quite involved with Holocaust education, all the relativizing and playing down of the Nazi period is not just hurtful, it is dangerous. Nothing else but dangerous, right? And the AfD does that in so many different ways. I wanted to show you.
And the rise of the far right is not limited to the US and Germany. It's a global phenomenon. Obviously, we've seen it here at home, and they're seeing it there, but we've also seen it in the UK, we've seen it in France, we've seen it in Brazil. But it is particularly troubling to think about the far right in Germany.
Germany has a history, right? It's not a country that was nicely described by Tocqueville, like, those Englishmen and women who came over and tried to come up with a new political system that they eventually called democracy, or made a democracy. Germany is in history is the country of Nazis.
That was Professor Thomas Schwendt, PhD chair of political science and quantitative methods in the social sciences at University of Mannheim.
Let's face it, and the country of Adolf Hitler. And he was not a communist, even if Musk says so. He was not a communist. He was a Nazi. He killed communists. He put them into jail and everything, right? Germany, of all countries, are very sensitive, even talking to right-wing politicians. You don't want to do this. It's just not what we do, what we are used to do, right? So for us, having a right-wing party in parliament is already disturbing. Really, it's disturbing.
To get some perspective on why Germany is seeing this rise of the far right and the AfD, I spoke to a woman who has been very carefully following these developments.
People started radicalizing online.
That's Nicola Hika, head of the State Coordination Office Against Far-Right Extremism in Bavaria. We spoke in Munich the day before the election.
There's a lot of lone wolf, which I don't like actually the term, because I think they are feeding from a network online, which is not necessarily a group, but the ideology is out there. And then there's a lot of radicalization over migration issues in Germany from 2015 onwards. We had Pegida, I'm not sure if you heard about them, the People of Europe Against the Islamization or something. They were the first movement. So it went from being a few groups on the fringes, actually, to becoming way more widespread in mainstream. I'd like to say it has always somewhat been there. So far-right extremism is not a matter of any fringe group. It's basically the people have share these attitudes, and they got activated somehow.
This is all sounding very familiar.
Right? In some ways, it's validating because we can get so caught up in our own domestic issues that it sometimes feels like we're the only ones experiencing these problems. But it can help you maybe feel a little less lonely to know that other countries are also coping with something similar.
In all of these cases, this extremism is growing from this perception of pain and disenfranchisement. Sometimes it's being imposed or manufactured. And this all leads to people looking for someone to blame, along with scapegoating.
The far-right feeds traditionally always has fed from crisis. It's that narrative of fear and crisis, and you can't really say we are living in good times. I mean, a lot of people say if it hadn't been for Merkel opening the borders, this wouldn't have happened. But this is nonsense. If you look at all of Europe, you see the exact same development in anywhere in the Western world, actually. So this isn't only migration. It's the very fact that the economy crashed in 2007. The very fact that in this country as well, we have a lot of people working and still living below the poverty line. I personally believe that what we are seeing is the impact of neoliberalism and globalization that actually has people losing, and the gap between rich and poor people gets wider and wider. And there's a lot of grievances out there that probably nobody addressed, or that are hard to be addressed because they are international and you can't tackle them on a domestic level. And then, of course, the far right always has simplified answers, a response to everything. You just blame migration, you just blame Syrian refugees, you blame politicians, you say it's because we are governed by an elite that is completely detached from reality. It's this anti-democratic stance that we had during COVID as well a lot, like the elites are pulling the strings, and this is what worked. A lot of people who can't make sense of the complexity we are dealing with, they go for simple, simplistic solutions and answers, and the far right provides this. If somebody from the Social Democrats sits on a podium, they are like me, they go on and it's probably very intellectual, and half the people are lost after 5 minutes, and the far right just acts on emotions, and that works very well.
This is a playbook that has been exploited so many times by the oppressor to divide people against each other and distract from what's really happening, which is often the consolidation of power and money in the hands of the few.
Right. And to your point, we see that with the far right in Germany. We see it with the far right today. We see it in 1930s Germany. We see it in the 1950s and 1970s in the United States. It's not new. There's the old saying, history may not always repeat, but it rhymes. What really drove all this home for me was that later in the trip, as we toured the Nazi rally grounds in Nuremberg, our amazing tour guide, Johnny Peckstein of Geschichte für alles, History for Everyone, reflected on his plans to leave Germany if the AfD would come to greater power.
I am very worried, to put it mildly, especially when I learn more about how it came to that and the propaganda, the online propaganda that happens. Oh, it's crazy. And I'm very worried. Next 4 years might be okay, but next election, I'm really worried. I have connections to Norway. That's where I will go to because I know the Nazis really hate me.
Now, Johnny is an expert on Nazi history, and standing by these peaceful duck ponds at the heart of Hitler's propaganda grounds and hearing him say how worried he was about Germany's future was haunting.
I know there's a global tilt toward far-right extremism. It's not just something the US and Germany are dealing with, but it does make me wonder how Germany's history plays into all of this. I mean, the history predating World War II. In the US, a lot of the contemporary issues roiling our society stem from our violent past. Colonialist dominance over Native Americans, slavery. In trying to course correct and grow, there's been a vicious backlash from a vocal minority of white Americans. Unfortunately, the way our electoral system is set up gives those voices an outsized impact in elections. Is something similar going on in Germany?
While Germany does have its own colonial history and a different relationship to slavery than we do in the US, for them, their violent history that's really relevant in modern day politics really does go back to Hitler and the Nazi Party. As Thomas Fentz said, Germany is seen to many as the country of Nazis. It's sort of become the specter that runs under the current of their contemporary political existence. It's a somber reality that they continue to have to grapple with every day. And their electoral system, their contemporary democracy today, has been set up with the commitment to ensure that those atrocities that they saw under Hitler don't happen again. One thing that really struck me on our tours was this reality of just how young Germany's democracy actually is. Germany's democratic origins are important. It informs everything about what they have built and what they built back then. The US fought the Revolutionary War to establish its democracy. Meanwhile, Germany lost a war, World War I, to get theirs. Hitler was able to capitalize on this perceived failure of democracy, a system which technically only came about in the final days of World War I.
Adolf Hitler did not overthrow a healthy democracy. He kicked in a rotten door.
That's Brendan McGurk, our fantastic tour guide through Munich, who was telling us about the volatile period in Germany after Germany lost World War I. Brendan met our learning tour on our very first day, which happened to be Election Day, Sunday, in Germany. Talking to Brendan as bells were ringing out from Munich's many churches on Sunday morning, it felt like an important moment to be there in this city steeped in history, in the rough foundations of German democracy and the rise and birth of the Nazi Party.
German democracy was simply staggering from crisis to crisis to crisis. At one point, because the Germans were not making their reparations repayments, the French occupied the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany, which caused great rage in Germany and furthered these feelings of defenselessness and humiliation, and this sense that the war wasn't over. It's just been fought on different fronts. And that was also the year, you've probably heard of the great German hyperinflation. You know, I'm sure you've heard the stories, people taking wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a cup of coffee. You ordered a cup of coffee and it was, 500 billion Reichsmarks. And the time you finished it, it was worth 1 trillion Reichsmarks.
As Brendan was talking to our group, walking amongst all of this history, the thing he really emphasized was that after World War I, during this economic crisis, the ground was just extremely fertile for Hitler to spread his message, especially to those disenfranchised and disgruntled men, mostly ex-military, who now felt like they didn't have a place in society.
Money died, and it just led to this feeling in this country that nothing was certain anymore. No one was secure, no one was safe. The German middle class suffered a psychological collapse. They lived in a world in which there were simply no foundations anymore. And Hitler spotted his opportunity to act.
A lot of the historians we talked to said that the United States today doesn't exactly remind them of 1930s, 1940s Nazi Germany. But what it does do is remind them of 1929 Germany, where there's rising worries about inflation, there's scapegoating other groups, there's the sense that the world is out to get you and taking advantage of you, and that we should focus on ourselves and think back about how good things used to be, and that we should make Germany great again. It's one thing when, like, Rachel Maddow says, this thing that the Trump administration has done is reminiscent of something that the Nazis did back in the Weimar Republic. People can roll their eyes and be like, yeah, whatever, Rachel. But for me, hearing, a German academic or a German historian make that explicit connection that what's happening in the US today is really reminiscent of or similar to or rhymes with policies of the Nazi Party from the early 1930s, it really just affected me differently.
Colin, this is all feeling really dark.
Yeah, it's an understatement, maybe.
I want to offer something hopeful. History is not inevitable, right? And our electoral system is not innate. We can change it. As you experienced, Colin, in person, as Germans voted in the snap February federal elections, German citizens seem largely happy with their mixed-member proportional electoral system. Proportional representation balances local representation with those of the country more broadly, and they've learned some very specific lessons and implemented some specific structural safeguards based on their tragic past.
And I think what shows how engaged the German people are is their rates of voter participation. In our last federal elections, we had about 60% voter turnout. In the German federal elections, there was 82.5% turnout.
I actually like the German electoral system quite a bit. Why? Because it's a combination of two things, at least. So we have proportional representation on the one side. I really like this. On the other side, we make sure that those politicians care about their local communities, about the electoral district.
Professor Thomas Schwendt was one of a number of people who told us that they generally like their system of government. February was just a really exciting time to be in Germany. So there was a snap election called because their government collapsed. Their previous coalition was called the Stoplight Coalition because the three parties that made it up used as their colors green, yellow, and red. Get it? It's a stoplight. But they eventually just couldn't agree anymore because they were too different. And so they stopped working together. So the government collapsed and they had to have an emergency election. We got to be at an election night party hosted by the Greens in Munich at a hip music hall just a few S-Bahn stops away from the city center. And it was really interesting because even though the Greens were sort of the big losers of the night, they went from being part of the coalition that was leading government to being out of the governing coalition and actually losing seats. And despite this, basically everyone at the party still seemed to like their system. They still said it was good and that they supported it and they thought it was democratic.
Colin, you and the MED team got to talk to people right outside the party. I want to hear what they had to say.
Because of the different system, we don't have to go to one of the different, left or the right parties. So we can choose from a big amount of parties in Germany, and you don't have to fear that the voice from you is not heard, because in America, if you vote for a small party, your voice will not be heard. And in Germany, it will be heard because of the different system.
I feel like we do that quite well because every party has the chance to go into parliament, and the new ones can build up, as we see. And then there's the 5% hurdle. So not every party can go into parliament and actually have the chance to go into the new coalition. So we don't have too many separate parties in one, but get a good picture of the mood in the population. So
I think voting is as easy as it can be, just the mechanics of it, just going to the polling station. It's I went in person today and it was a 5-minute thing in total.
It just sounds like people didn't just go home and cry in their drinks like I did in 2016.
Yeah, I remember how in 2016 at the election night party I was at, filled with campaign staffers and folks who worked on left of center campaigns, the vibe was literally like a funeral. People were sobbing. Some folks were despondent. Some folks were just kind of staring at the TV, glassy-eyed. Folks checked out, and it was awful. So needless to say, not at all the experience in Germany at their losing party election night party. It's just not the same kind of zero-sum football game there. Germany's electoral system is called mixed member proportional, which basically combines the local winner-take-all elections, very similar to how we have them here in the US, with a party list system, which is very common in most of Europe. They're used together to produce proportional representation overall. Essentially, as a voter, you get 2 votes. One to vote for the representative of your local district, and one for a political party, the party that you like best. All this together determines who goes to parliament.
When you make sure you have a PR system, that also makes sure that, those elected politicians care about their local communities. And therefore, mixed electoral systems, there's this saying in the literature, then you kind of have the best of both worlds. So you have some kind of a local accountability because you vote for a particular candidate, and if you don't like this candidate, you don't vote for him, and then this person might not get elected to parliament. But you can also vote for parties, right? So therefore, in mixed electoral systems, you have two votes.
Germany is not perfect. They are seeing a rise of the far right. Their democracy has its own challenges. And yet, despite the unprecedented rise of the far right, they remain out of governing political power, which is not something that's true for the far right in the US.
Okay, so what I think I'm hearing here is Germany is making efforts to keep a watchful eye on extremist groups and to keep them out of having meaningful political power. And in the wake of World War II, this has been largely successful due to a few checks that they have actually built into their system.
Right. Number one is this 5% threshold. Basically, Germany requires that a political party receive at least 5% of the vote as a threshold you have to clear in order to win representation in the Bundestag. So nationwide, your party needs at least 5% of the vote, with one tiny exception here, which has to do with something called a direct mandate. We'll get to that later. The important thing is the 5% threshold makes sure that small fringe parties with, 1% of the vote that supports them, 2% of the vote that supports them, they're not able to generate a lot of electoral noise or go and muck up everything in the Bundestag.
Number two, Germany actually permits political parties to be banned if they are deemed anti-democratic, anti-constitutional, or otherwise a threat to democracy.
Yeah, that's kind of nuts. At first blush to our sensitive American ears, that might sound like, a party that's banning free speech. But it isn't really any more than banning hate crimes or banning hate speech.
Yeah, we're going to talk about this more later in depth because that is a really interesting concept.
And the third check is the firewall, which in German translates to die Brandmauer. Since World War II, there has been a norm in German politics, the firewall against the far right, which basically means that all parties in Germany have agreed, regardless of if they're on the left or the center or the right, that they will not form a governing coalition with the far right. The firewall emerged explicitly to stop another Nazi party from ever coming to power. Remember that the Nazis only came to power in the first place because the center-right joined forces with them. And, ever since, the firewall has consistently prevented the far right from ever being part of a governing coalition. Even when there were opportunities to do so that may have actually benefited the center-right politically, the firewall held.
It makes me wish we had a firewall in the US so that the far-right elements in the US would have more trouble gaining momentum and power. It's easy to forget now, but in 2016, most establishment Republicans in office swore they'd never support Trump. J.D. Vance.
Senator Vance, in 2016, you called your running mate Donald Trump unfit for the nation's highest office, and you said he could be America's Hitler.
Marco Rubio.
There is no way we are going to allow a con artist to take over the conservative movement, and Donald Trump is a con artist.
Lindsey Graham.
He's a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot. He doesn't represent my party. He doesn't represent the values that the men and women who wear the uniform are fighting for.
Ted Cruz.
This man is a pathological liar. He doesn't know the difference between truth and lies. He lies practically every word that comes out of his mouth.
And yet, even in Germany, with their provisions, their far right, AfD, has about 20% of support as of this election. And while the firewall held in this election, there is serious concern looking ahead to the next elections, most likely in 2029.
I also do want to plug here that if you actually do go back to the 2015-2016 Republican presidential primary, most of the polling actually showed that fewer than half of Republicans supported Trump. Most Republicans supported Rubio or Cruz or Christie or Kasich, which means in 2016 United States, the far-right MAGA movement had about as much popular support as the AfD did in Germany in 2025. And yet we can see these two case studies go in very different directions.
I wouldn't rule out that the firewall is falling.
Nicola actually tracks far-right extremism in Bavaria as her job, right? So when she said that, my ears really perked up.
I would rule out that they ever have a majority in this country. Let's wait and see. I mean, a couple of more terror attacks, an economic crisis, what is then seen as a complete failure of the established parties, combined with climate change, with all the problems we are facing, can probably lead to that as well. Because 15 years ago, had you asked me, I would not have seen the situation we are now in. And I've been doing this job for more than 15 years. That means if you had told me that this is 2025 and this is happening, I would have laughed out loud also about hearing news from the United States. I would have said, sorry, no, this is too far-fetched. Please, you can't put that in your movie script.
I talked with Nicola about how the far right sort of took over the Republican Party in the United States. And I asked if she was worried that the same thing could have happened in Germany if they had used the US electoral system with their far right.
Absolutely. I do believe that if we had the same system for a while already, we probably would have the same situation.
And I think it's worth mentioning that, this is hard stuff to talk about and to listen to and to think about. It's heavy.
It is heavy. And I think that it's really heavy, especially for those of us who carry the identities and the weight of oppression in our daily lives, right? I work in racial justice and I don't like the feel or the sound of the name Hitler coming out of my mouth so often. I don't like listening to it. I don't like saying it, but we have to do it. It is important for us to face the past as we are trying to construct a beautiful future, or at least a tolerable future. And we are in a really dark place right now that makes it necessary for us to do this.
Couldn't agree more. And I guess in that spirit, let's keep going there.
Colin, our goal here is to give people the tools to grapple with what's going on, to educate and not gaslight folks. This is a serious moment. That is true. But there are ways out of this. In the short term, we really have to find and seize any opportunity we can to protect our communities.
And in the long term, that's why we talk so much about the need to shift electoral systems, because we can enfranchise people. We can design our systems for inclusion rather than exclusion.
Right. The waters we swim in, like you talked about in season 1, they can be changed. Our democratic system is one of many. There's actually a lot of other systems out there, and these systems have worked for other countries that are engaged in this hard process of making sure their electoral system ensures their citizens are represented and that far-right extremists are not enabled.
And we know that this isn't just theory. We can look at these other countries and see that by a lot of metrics, they're doing elections better than we are. And instead of being proud and having to plug our ears and ignore it, we can learn from them. We can try to do things better. And the Germans are rooting for us too. They want to see an American democracy that functions better than what they're seeing from across the pond. Here's Tom Wilmersdorfer from the election night watch party that we were at with the Greens.
We don't have fascists in power in Germany, other than other countries in the world right now. So, and also we have 20% of the AfD, of votes for the AfD, which still means it's 80% of people not voting for fascists. And I think we still have a chance to fight fascism and to keep the democratic system going. But on the other hand, I'm very concerned. I mean, we have internationally right now fascists are rising. We have Putin in Russia, and frankly, Trump in the US, for me, is right now putting up a fascist system. And so I'm really, really strongly hoping that the American people will find ways to oppose this, because this very much smells and tastes like things that I've learned in history about German history. And this is something I hope we will find ways to contain in the world.
Are we saying that the U.S. should just drop everything and be like Germany?
No, obviously not.
Right. But it is worthwhile to take the time and look at how another country is grappling with similarly entrenched problems.
And it's funny because throughout all of our tours and discussions in Germany, folks kept referring to the age of the U.S. democracy, saying things like, oh, well, I know we're not as old as U.S. democracy. And every time I would hear this, I would feel some cognitive dissonance, because I don't think older necessarily means better. Maybe it's more antiquated and it needs to be updated. And we know that true representation in the US is not only still questionable, but unquestionably, women and people of color receiving the right to be represented was itself a centuries-long battle.
we still believe having choice and proportional representation is something that we can strive for in the US, even when those results are mixed.
And by the way, this is not just going to be a Nazi Germany US parallel podcast. We're also going to be looking at what happened after the war, how West German democracy was built, what happened in the strictly divided society with the formation of East Germany, where you had German citizens still arbitrarily split apart from their neighbors, and how all of these societies diverged over the course of 30 years before grappling with reunifying when they had two very different ways of being, seeing the world, and thinking about their own history. Sometimes it feels like red and blue states are just as divergent as East and West Germany are today.
To understand Germany's election in 2025 and concerns looking into the 2029 election, we need to go back to the relatively recent forming of Germany's democracy. That's up next on The Future of Our Former Democracy.
The Future of Our Former Democracy is a production of More Equitable Democracy and Large Media. That's LARJ Media. Our producer-editors are Maria Paleologos and Isaac Kaplan-Woolner, with help from Corrine Kiltow. Sean Simmons engineered the show. Tina Knoll is principal and head of creative at Large Media. Fact-checking by Martin Lang. Special thanks to Faith Ombadi, George Chung, and Marty Reamer. If you like what you've heard today, please share this episode with someone you think needs to hear it. Personal recommendations are still the best way to get the word out. And of course, rate and review the show. It really does help. For links and more information on today's episode, check out the show notes at www.equitabledemocracy.org.
The Berlin airlift is an incredible situation between June 1948 and May 49, in which the Americans want to introduce a new currency in West Germany, the Deutsche Mark, the D-Mark, and they also want to introduce that in West Berlin. And on the first day of that Berlin blockade, the American General Lucius Clay sits down in front of the press and explains that he is going to fly everything in. That 2.1 million people in West Berlin need to survive. But this is exactly where this American confidence is quite impressive for post-war Germans.
My grandfather, who worked for Alaska Airlines, flew missions for the Berlin airlift. So I've got a connection there as well.
Oh, wow. You'll have to...
And that's why I'm wearing the jacket.
Get another coat.
That's right. Have I told you the story of this jacket?
No, please tell me, because it's so cute. I mean, handsome. You know,
no, I'll take it all.
Strong.